Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Dubcast with Dubside. My name is Andrew Elizaga, and I will be the co-host for this podcast. I'm very excited to have with me on the phone today internationally famous Greenland-style kayaking expert Dubside.
All right, you can describe me that way, but I guess I'm internationally famous in kayaking circles.
How would you like to be introduced? I mean, how do people introduce you?
Well, yeah, you can introduce me that way. That's what people do. I was at this event in Virginia, and at that event, the organizer, is introducing all the instructors, and we're all lined up along the lake there. And he says, all the instructors out here at this weekend they're volunteering for this. Some of them are professional kayakers. Some of them are world renowned. And I'm looking around and I'm thinking, oh, I guess he's talking about me.
Well, it's true. You know, I should take a minute to introduce myself. I'm a sea kayaker based in the Pacific Northwest and the author of the Dashpoint Pirate blog. I'm also an amateur filmmaker, and I've won a few awards in film festivals for my short documentary films. And I've been a Greenland-style enthusiast ever since I started sea kayaking. I first met you at the South Sound Traditional Sea Kayak Symposium in Washington State when you first started working on your own instructional videos.
Yes.
You want to mention those?
So I did actually the one about the Greenland rolling, how to roll a kayak using Greenland-style techniques. I did one about the Greenland rope gymnastics, some exercise done on land. And I did a documentary about how Greenland kayaking got popular in this country.
I think one of your greatest contributions to the sport of sea kayaking has been documenting the history of Greenland style in the United States and helping bring Greenland style to more and more people. And you really become something of a sea kayaking ambassador and representative of Greenland style.
Yeah, I guess you could say that.
Okay, so without further ado, I present episode 1 of the Dubcast with Dubside.
Welcome to the Dubcast with Dubside. The subject here is kayaking. Sea kayaking, to be precise. I'm Dubside, and Andrew Elizaga is also in on the project. And we are going to tell you about people in sea kayaking and places, equipment, techniques, the culture, especially Greenland culture, because the Arctic is where kayaks come from. Some of the people I'll tell you about include Maligiaq Padilla, Derek Hutchinson, Nigel Foster, George Grunseth, Helen Wilson, Cheri Perry, Greg Stamer, Freya Hofmeister, Anders Dugason, Johan Wersen, Ichi Ito, Sarah Wagner, John Peterson, Karen Marie Jensen, and many, many others. These are friends of mine I've met through kayaking in my travels all over the world. I'll also tell you about places and events that I go to, some of them on a regular basis. And these would include the Greenland National Kayak Championships held in Greenland, the Delmarva Paddlers Retreat, the East Coast Canoe and Kayak Festival, Kayak Treff, that's an event in Stokke, Norway, Kayak Republic, that's in Copenhagen, Denmark, Kayak Academy, that's in the Seattle area, Tips, an event in South Carolina, Hergif, an event in New York, Guts, an event in Japan, Pagaya, an event in Spain, and many other places I go to or have been to in my travels. I'll be talking about kayak gear, such as VHF marine radios, carbon fiber paddles, wetsuits, dry suits, a thing called a tuilik, and a thing called a norsok. I'll explain what those are. I'll be discussing kayak techniques, including rolling, technique I'm very fond of, paddling at night, paddling in ice water, about rolling in ice water, also taking a folding kayak, that's a collapsible kayak, on trains, buses, or planes, or trolleys. And in regards to Greenland, I'll be talking about the Greenlandic language, which I am not at all fluent in. I know a few words, though. It's a fascinating language, has no relationship to English. Here's a word in Greenlandic that you already know. It's the word kayak, except they don't say kayak in Greenland, they say kayak, and they spell it Q-A-J-A-Q. Along with the language, Greenland has a fascinating culture. They have a different outlook on things sometimes. I'll tell you about some of the happy interactions I've had in Greenland, as well as some of the not so happy ones. I've made some rather egregious social blunders, but I learned some lessons, I think. Some of the food they have to eat in Greenland is vastly different from what we have in the U.S. Some of it you cannot legally get in the U.S., such as seal and whale. I've had some very tasty meals in Greenland, but I can get even more excited about Greenlandic music. Be prepared to learn and hear Greenlandic music in detail. And the format for this Dubcast is obviously audio. There may be some supplemental videos that Andrew can post somewhere. I'll leave that up to him, but the audio will hopefully stand on its own so you don't have to look at the videos. We're going for about a 30-minute length for each episode, though it could extend up to maybe an hour depending on how things go. And I will do my thing first, and then Andrew will have the last word, and he may contact some of the people I mentioned to get comment from them, or whatever else he wants to do. I'm intending to have each episode build on the previous episodes so that it's like one big long story made up of lots of little stories. I'll make an effort to bear in mind that some of the terminology we have in Greenland kayaking is rather esoteric and not found in any common dictionary. For example, if I said, I lent my tuilik to Maligiaq at Hergif, I'll have to explain that the tuilik is a garment that's worn for kayaking, covers the head and arms, and goes down to the cockpit of the kayak. Maligiaq is Maligiaq Padilla, a top Greenland kayaker. We'll hear a lot more about him. And Hergif is an acronym for the Hudson River Greenland Festival, an event that takes place every early summer usually in the New York area. And don't worry, you'll get more familiar with these words as we go along. Overall, I hope to make this entertaining, informative, and inspiring. And to keep things from getting too dull, I'll throw in the background a little guitar like this, or maybe some other audio scraps I picked up in my travels. To tell you who I am, my name is Dubside. That's one word, the whole name, D-U-B-S-I-D-E. And I'm known in traditional kayaking circles for rolling, the technique of turning a kayak upside down and coming back up without coming out of the kayak, and ropes. That refers to a set of techniques that evolved from the Arctic as a training system for kayaking. And these are exercises done on land on ropes. I'll tell you a lot more about that later. And I also am known for folding kayaks, using a folding kayak. That's a collapsible kayak that goes into a large backpack kind of thing that can be taken on public transportation, which I did a lot of. And another characteristic trait of mine is that I always wear the color black. I started paddling in Philadelphia in 1998. And I moved out to Seattle about 2005. Lived out there for several years, and now I live on the East Coast when I'm not traveling. And about half the year I'm traveling when there's not a worldwide pandemic, which brings everything to a halt. But my normal travel involves about the middle of the springtime I head down to South Carolina. Then a week or two there. Then I'm out on the West Coast, the Washington State, maybe down to Oregon. Come back across to New York sometime in June or so, early June. Then I head overseas, and I'm in Norway, Denmark, Sweden, and usually Greenland. And that takes me from July into August. And sometimes I'm in Iceland or Finland. And I get back, and I'm often in Michigan and Minnesota into September. And then I hit event in Delaware in the beginning of October. And then I'm often down in Georgia for the end of the season, which takes me up to about November. Those are my regular stops, and then occasionally I'm in the Southern Hemisphere or other places. Some of these are commercial symposiums. Some of these are sponsored by one particular business. Some of these are sponsored by an organization, especially one called Kayak USA. That's Qajaq USA, which is a very worthwhile organization I've been involved with for a long time. And their website, qajaquusa.org, is a very informative thing. I'd suggest you check it out sometime. Their mission is to promote all things to do with traditional kayaking in this country, and they are a recognized part of Kanakatufiat, which is the Greenland Kayak Association in Greenland. When I first started paddling, I wrote down the trip I took, where I went, what kayak I had, what gear I used, and I have continued to do that to the present time. And I have a very thick set of folders that has every single time I've ever gone paddling, wherever I was, whatever I used. I'll give you tips from time to time during the Dubcast. And here's a tip right now. When you go paddling, make a logbook and write down where you went and what you did and anything interesting that happened and the people that you paddle with. And keep track of that. And do that every time, and then over the years, you'll have something you can look back on and recall these different things and gain some insights from that. Now, I'll tell you about the first time I ever kayaked and the first time I ever bought a kayak and etc. But let's jump ahead to something interesting. I'll get back to the other stuff later. By 2002, I knew how to roll. That's another whole story I'll get into. But I'd used a book that was written by a guy named Derek Hutchinson, who goes way, way back in sea kayaking to the 60s or 70s, did a whole lot of firsts back then, and involved in the development of the sport quite a bit. And he had a book called I think it's the Complete Book of Sea Kayaking by Derek Hutchinson. It's republished several times with new editions. And in this book, he's got these pictures he drew that you're supposed to turn upside down, and then you can see what it looks like when you're upside down in your kayak, where to set up the paddle, how to do the roll. And I studied these pictures, but it didn't enlighten me too much. I didn't learn how to roll that way, but I was somewhat inspired by reading all about this great guy, Derek Hutchinson, and all these things that he did and all this information he knew about kayaking. So in 2002, I went to, for the first time, the East Coast Canoe and Kayak Festival, which I don't think they have that anymore, but this took place in Charleston, South Carolina for many, many years. And so the first year I go there, I'm on there. It's a little lake they have there, and they set up the booths around the manufacturers and dealers all on the side selling their stuff, and they have a place to do demonstrations and instruction happening. And I was practicing rolling before the classes started, and I had a two-piece paddle, and I had two two-piece paddles. And I would put one on the back deck, and I would practice with the other one, practice rolling, going over and over just to warm up and work on my skills. And then I turned around after a while, and I only had half a paddle on the back deck because one paddle had fallen off. So the wind was blowing towards one side of the lake, so I had to paddle over there because I figured the half paddle blew over there somewhere. So I'm walking up and down, paddling up and down along the shoreline looking for a paddle. And who do I see standing there but Mr. Derek Hutchinson? he was on the program. He was teaching classes that weekend. I knew he looked like the pictures in the book. And so he comes over to me, and I explained to him that I had lost half a paddle and was looking for it along the shore there. And I told him that I had a two-piece paddle because I had a folding kayak, so I had to be able to take the paddle apart when I took the kayak apart to fit it in a bag. And he looks down at me on the water from up on the shore, and he says in that British accent of his, "I've taught British soldiers how to deploy their folding kayaks from a submarine." Yeah, well, what are you supposed to say to that? Well, excuse me, Mr. Hutchinson. Why don't I just sink to the bottom of this lake and stay down there? Well, in later years, I became an instructor at that symposium and got to interact with Derek a lot more and not be so intimidated by him. But he is intimidating. Was intimidating. Derek's not with us anymore, but he was quite the presence on the kayak scene for a long time. The other big name of British kayak instructors is a guy named Nigel Foster. And Nigel he's got a different personality. Nigel is very approachable. He's not overbearing at all. A really nice guy. And he and Derek were the top names at this East Coast Canoe and Kayak Festival every year. The highlight of that symposium was Saturday night, the on-water demonstration. They had bleachers on the side, and they had lights out on the water. And people would come out and there was like Karen Knight, she was the master of freestyle canoeing, would do this amazing, graceful display to music on the water. And Nigel would do he had this precision stroke kind of thing. He could just make the kayak do anything he wanted. It was like he had his forefinger and his thumb just on the paddle, like with that kind of fine tuning, just a little tweak of the blade, just make that kayak do anything. Nigel would get this graceful progression of turns and leans going on, and suddenly in the middle of it, he would be going backwards while paddling forwards, and keep it up for several strokes. And if later on you tried it yourself, you'd conclude that that's impossible. How does he do that? Well, this evening show in Charleston also had a Greenland component, and the Greenland routines got more and more sophisticated every year as people got better and better at the techniques. I'm going to tell you about a rolling routine done one particular year, but I'm going to tell you the way a Greenland seal hunter would tell it. Okay, Saturday night, demonstration, time for the Greenland part. A kayak comes out and starts going through the Greenland rolls, beginning with Kingolfikpashashlu Nofashashlugu, that's the standard Greenland roll, moving on to Pakasumishlugu, rolling with the paddle on the crook of the elbow, and advancing to Bachipkashluatuamishlu Ishluinamik, just one hand holding the end of the paddle against the shoulder. And they continue on to the throwing stick rolls, Nosamik Masikut, Nosamik Kingokut, Nosamik Nofreshashlugu, and the hand rolls, Asamik, fist rolls, Asakpekushlugu, and then an assistant on shore has a brick, gives that to the person in the kayak, and they go out and roll with just the brick in their hand. And as the demonstration appears to be building up to a climax, the assistant on the water takes the brick back and hands the kayaker a lit candle. The kayaker slides out away from the shore and, holding the candle in one hand, goes into the water, candle still out of the water, passes the lit candle from one hand to the other, rolls up with the free hand, and the candle is still lit. Audience is amazed. This takes the rolling demonstration to a whole new level. Person in the water says, "I got one more roll to do." And this causes a bit of a stir because how do you top rolling with a lit candle? Person says, "Can you give me back that brick?" Then, with a brick in one hand and a candle in the other hand, and with every eye in the audience glued to those two objects, the kayak turns over, the brick goes down into the water, hand with the brick comes up on the other side, sets the brick down on the kayak, candle is exchanged from one hand to the other, Freehand grabs the brick and rolls back up. Candle is still lit, brick is retained. Audience is, as you can imagine, extremely impressed. Now, I told that story the way a seal hunter would tell it, not because I used the Greenlandic names of the rolls, but because I left out one further detail. The person in the water doing these rolls was me. But a real seal hunter would never say that. You see, seal hunters are very reluctant to tout their own achievements or toot their own horn. They will, however, mask their achievements by harping on their failures. I'm not a seal hunter, but let me harp on some of my failures right now. The first time I did that brick and candle roll in Charleston was the only time I ever got it to work there. I've done that many times in front of audiences in other places all over the world, but in Charleston it only worked once. That's because the next year I tried it, I think it was raining too much, and the following year I think the wind blew the candle out. I had magic birthday relight candles that are supposed to come back on after you blow them out. The wind still blew it out. I think the last time I did that roll, when I would go to Charleston, I would take a bus or a train, so I couldn't bring a whole brick down. It's too much to carry. So I would be down there and have to find a brick somewhere. And Charleston is a very clean, well-kept park, and there aren't any loose bricks anywhere you can find. So I would have to find somebody that would get me a brick somewhere. I think the one year, one of the staff members said they'd gone home and pulled it out of their garden and said, my wife's going to kill me if I don't get this back. I said, don't worry, I've never dropped this brick during a rolling demonstration. And so that night, I have duties to do throughout the day, teaching classes and going to eat dinner and things. And so I'd stashed the brick under the bleachers so it would be there in position when I needed it. And I came that evening in a rush to get all ready for the demo, and other people had already started, and I couldn't find the brick. And I'm looking at the bleachers, and I'm like, wait, where's the brick? Where's the brick? Wait, I can't find the brick. And I'm asking people, and I'm trying, hurry. And they said, somebody said, oh, yeah, the brick, yes. So there was some kids earlier this afternoon playing with a brick. I think they threw it in the lake. So no brick and candle roll. And I only got that to work the first time in Charleston. Well, if you put 2 kayaks in the water for a rolling demonstration or 3 kayaks in the water, it opens up all kinds of creative possibilities. And over the years in Charleston, other people were involved. Cheri Perry and Helen Wilson did a very nice routine set to music. Helen Wilson has been involved in some of those demonstrations. I can't think of any other event I go to where they had an on-water show at night done. That was always a very special part of the Charleston event. In the final years, they had redone the schedule. They stopped having that, which I felt was rather unfortunate, but that was always a very special event. Maybe they'll revive that sometime in the future. We'll see. Well, several years after doing these demonstrations and instructing at the Charleston event, I'd gotten to, I can't say I was on equal footing with Derek Hutchinson because he is Derek Hutchinson, but he knew my name eventually and gave me some respect. And so one time he says to me, you've changed the sport. Referring to the Greenland rolling element in it. And I don't think he's saying that I personally changed the sport, but just that all this, the Greenland input with me and other people had changed the sport. He said, you've changed the sport. I said, no, I'll never admit to that in public, but you have changed the sport. That was Derek. He'd pay you a compliment and then qualify it, so it didn't quite apply all the way. I got a few more good Derek stories, which we'll get to eventually. I got a good Gordon Brown story, too. Of course, that means to set the story up, I have to explain who Gordon Brown is. So we'll just put that on hold till later. Him and Cheri Perry and Helen Wilson and all those people we'll get to in time. Don't worry. Before I end this first episode, we'll touch on Greenlandic music. And there's a song they have in Greenland. This ties music directly to kayaking. This is called the Kayak Song. That's what I call it anyway. And they sing this during the competition in Greenland at any time. They can just break into it. Somebody will just start singing, and it's one of those kumbaya kind of things. You hold hands, you stand up, and you sway back and forth. And so I'll get into all the lyrics to it later sometime. But it talks about the kayak and how much of part of Greenland culture it is, and how much they respect it. And the first line says, I myself have never tried it, but I hear, but I'd like to tell you something about our dear little kayak thing. And so if they're say it's a mealtime at the dining place and everybody's just sitting around, and somebody will start singing it, sort of, I'll give you a little sample of that. It sounds a little bit like this. All right, so to put it all together, the full there's maybe 5 or so verses. I have a couple different recordings of it that I can splice together and make a full version of the song. So I'll let you listen to that right now. All right, I will not subject you to the entire song right now. There are better versions of that we will get into in the future. Here's the final verse goes like this. We'll skip to that. See, when they just start singing it without accompaniment, they just bust into the first line, Uanga Naminek. But if there's a band playing or on recorded versions of it, there's a very distinctive introductory riff. It goes like this. They're very proud of their kayak in Greenland. It's a very respected part of their heritage. And for the most part, no one is really hunting from kayaks anymore. Well, and for the most part, there are some minor exceptions. But in the old days, when an actual seal hunter would go out with a kayak to hunt seals, that's what the kayak was used for. With the introduction of motorboats and firearms, the kayak almost completely died out. But there were still enough people doing it, and enough attention paid in time before all the old seal hunters died off that they were able to keep the tradition alive and keep the understanding of kayaks and techniques and things from being completely forgotten. And I've met some old seal hunters in Greenland and been able to talk directly to these guys who actually did it themselves. It's quite amazing. I'll talk more about that in episodes to come. Well, I hope you've been intrigued enough to want to listen to more. For some final words, I'll turn it over to Andrew for a minute or two, and see you on Dubcast number 2.
Be sure to check out the show notes for some links, including to Dubside's 2 videos, Greenland Rolling with Dubside and Modern Greenland Kayaking, available on my YouTube channel. The Dubcast with Dubside will continue next week, so be sure to subscribe, and you can also follow us on YouTube. If you have any questions for Dubside, or if you just want to let us know what you think of this podcast, feel free to drop us an email at dubcastwithdubside@gmail.com, and we will answer your questions in the upcoming episodes. Also, please consider donating through Patreon at Dubcast with Dubside. You can also donate directly using PayPal to our email address, dubcastwithdubside@gmail.com. All proceeds go to support Dubside's next sea kayaking adventure, so he can return with more knowledge, insights, and amazing stories.